Welcome everyone to the latest policy webinar. I'm delighted today to be joined by Guilherme Rodrigues from Centre for Cities, who's going to be talking to us about globally competitive cities. How it's going to work today, I'll provide a brief but also light introduction, hopefully also thought-provoking. And Guilherme will run through some slides with a lot more thought-provoking content. And then what we'll do at the end, I'll try and field or compare or host a bit of a question and answer session. So in introducing this, globally competitive cities, it's clear that despite some jesting, London is that mega city. Really, and nothing within the UK comes close on a range of different metrics. So using FDI here, but really London competes with New York, Paris, Tokyo. And if we had other metrics, you would similarly see sort of London miles ahead. And this, and whilst London creates a range of spillovers, I think we're all aware that spillovers are not the answer to economic development challenges outside of London. But also London's peculiar position of being so far ahead of the rest of the country on a range of metrics is both a blessing and a curse. So, and that's really what the Levelling Up white paper is wrestling with. It's wrestling with how to bring other areas up to London's indicators, London's wealth and prosperity. It's also wrestling with how to address issues within London. So, for example, higher levels of child poverty and higher levels of deprivation in certain areas, but also how to ensure more equity and better economic and social and environmental indicators outside of London and the southeast, really. And that issue, so the issue of how to level up and what to do with London as arguably UK's only globally competitive city, has been likened to a golden goose. So for those that aren't aware, that the golden goose really is that goose that creates wealth, creates prosperity, and this creates a number of policy conflicts or questions. So how do you keep the goose golden? How do you retain London's dominance in world terms, but also how do you ensure its competitive nature, and how do you prolong that? But also, how do you spread the golden eggs from the goose more equitably? How do you create spillovers that are that contribute to economic development outside of London? But also, most importantly, perhaps for South Yorkshire, how do you get more geese to be golden? How do you get more? How do you get a gaggle of geese to be more golden? How do you grow its brothers and sisters up to be golden too? So, moving on from geese permanently, you'll be pleased to hear. Economic development is a fast-moving area, and Centre for Cities for me have been at the leading edge of this for a range of different topics. And what Guilherme will run through, we'll touch upon many economic development theories around economic diversity, concentration, but also complexity. But there are challenges within that. So an economy can be more diverse, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that economy will grow. An economy can have a concentration of a certain industry, and many local economies have that, but that is also not a sure sign that economic development will be driven by those concentrations. And latterly, really, economic complexity is being developed as really a theoretical model, across academia and also by researchers to explore really how knowledge and specialization interact within an economy, within a systemic way. And Guilherme will talk more about this, but there are plans afoot to explore our economy in more detail. But what this is starting to unpick is how machine learning applications can be applied to understanding our economy. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Guilherme, who's got his own slides. So if you're able to share those, I'll go on mute and won't talk about geese any longer. Over to you, Guilherme.
Can you see my slides?
We can, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you all to be here at lunchtime. So I think, as Jonathan said in the presentation, the Leveling Up white paper rightly gave some focus on the issue of global competitive cities, and we know that London competes very well with other mega cities in the world, Tokyo, Singapore, New York, and one of the challenges and things that the center has been saying for many years is that our large cities, especially in the North and Midlands, has not been performing as well as the second, third, fourth cities in some of these places, like let's say Lyon in France, Hamburg or Bremen in Germany, Osaka in Japan. So we have been seeing this problem, and we think that the government, to some extent, it's framing the diagnosis is right in the Leveling Up white paper, that we miss this strong economic engines, maybe not as large as London, but very important and thriving, but at the same time, we did not see a very, very clear framework how to evaluate the global competitive cities in the Leveling white paper. So we tried to build a simple framework that basically looks at productivity, which is one of the core metrics in the missions of the white paper, and size. So we think for a city, broadly speaking, to be a global competitive city, it needs to be highly productive, which reflects being competitive in the international environment, but also it needs to be large enough to be, as Jonathan said, like to have more geese, like to be large enough to spread benefits and spillovers around its region. So, and using this framework, we identified, not very surprised, that London, it's the only globally competitive city in the UK. We have other productive cities, highly productive. Milton Keynes is a good example, Reading another one. But unfortunately, they are not. Sorry. Can you see my slides?
We can, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay. But unfortunately, what we see is that London is the only one. The other ones that are highly productive, like Reading and Milton Keynes, are not that large. And in the G7 context, UK is the only country that we observe with a single global competitive city. A country like France has 5, Germany 8, and the UK even underperforms if we compare with mid-sized countries in Europe like Sweden, the Netherlands, and Spain that we identified as having 2, and it performs in line with relatively smaller countries with less than 10 million residents like Austria, Ireland, and Finland, where the capital city is the only city that we identify as globally competitive. But as we know, these things, they are not binary, and there's progress over time. So this chart, we can see GDP per worker over time, OECD data. The dashed line was the threshold that we used that includes around 40% of the cities in OECD as being above this threshold. And we see that, broadly speaking, the large cities in the UK are significantly below this threshold, but they are making improvements in general. Unfortunately, we see that South Yorkshire productivity has been mostly stable in the last 2 decades and been diverging with some of the more optimistic trends we have seen in places like Manchester, for example, that we know that the economy and the city center has been developing in the last decade or so, and unfortunately we don't see the same dynamics in South Yorkshire yet. So the theory of economic complexity, as mentioned before, I think it's a good way of trying to understand the strengths, the weaknesses, and the challenges of South Yorkshire economy. So as we know, we are a center for cities and we have our own definition of cities. You can see we in South Yorkshire actually say that the combined authority is composed by 3 cities, Doncaster, Barnsley, and Sheffield. Sheffield in our definition includes Rotherham as well, and this is based on daytime population from the last census. But when we did this analysis, economic complexity started being a metric done at international level, looking at exports and understanding which countries export what. We can see where are their economic competitive advantages, and then by the diversity and the rarity and the ubiquity of the products, we can understand the level of complexity. So it's very important to understand that being rare, it's not necessarily complex. So if we have a very rare activity in an environment, but it is normally, it tends to be clustered with very, very non-rare activities, let's say coal mining next to agriculture or warehousing, we would see coal mining as a not so complex activity. Whatever, if you have like pharmaceuticals being rare and they cluster around other rare activities like, let's say, advertisement, reinsurance, fund management, we would consider all these activities as complex. So we can see these are the activities. Our data, as most of the papers at the urban level, uses employment instead of exports because of the ability of getting the data. And we can see that the top 10 occupations in our analysis tend to be services related with finance, advertisement, some levels of manufacturing, programming as well. And the bottom 10 occupations in our cities tend to be related with some type of mining and manufacturing as well. And when we cross this score, so each city gets a score based on their competitive advantages, we can see first that the economic complexity score seems to be very correlated with the productivity levels. Most complex and productive cities tend to be in the Greater Southeast and Edinburgh as well. So we can see in this chart is the top right corner. And then unfortunately, we see the 3 cities that we analyze in South Yorkshire. They have low levels of complexity and low levels of productivity, and which are the red dots. The purple dots are the other large cities that I showed in the previous slide with the productivity performance in the last 2 decades. And we can see that productivity tends to be slightly higher, maybe not as high as we would like to, but the level of complexity, with the exception of Birmingham, seems to be higher than the cities in South Yorkshire. And when we look historically, so our paper covers economic complexity at 2019 and also 1981 with census data on occupations. And here we can see that the top right corner, it's mostly cities in the Greater Southeast that used to be very complex in the 80s and remain complex. And the purple dots, where we see Barnsley, Doncaster, and Sheffield, unfortunately, we see them located in a quadrant bottom left, where they used to be low complexity 81 and they remain low complexity. And most of the large cities, we have been seeing some emergence. So in 81, they were seen as low complexity, places like Manchester, Leeds, Glasgow, Nottingham. And nowadays, their complexity levels improved. For the South Yorkshire cities, we can look at the table on the right and see that the most important employer in terms of exporting activities used to be coal in Barnsley and Doncaster in 81, steel in Sheffield, highly concentrated economies, especially Barnsley and Doncaster. The vast majority of exporting jobs were in these activities, and the transition into warehousing everywhere, also quite concentrated, not to the same extent, but we can see the transition between one activity to the other in the last 4 decades. And under this methodology, these activities are classified as not very complex, which make productivity gains harder to attain. So, and we can see on, which I think it's a very important point as well, on the bottom right quadrant, we have Aberdeen, Blackpool, Swansea, and Luton. These places became relatively less complex over time, and we know from our analysis that they remain doing the same activities that they used to. Gas and oil in Aberdeen, for example, auto manufacturing and airport activities in Luton, Blackpool, aerospatial manufacturing, they were able to remain doing the same activities. But as the economy became more complex and moved towards services, they became relatively less complex. While the places like London, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Brighton, they reinvented themselves. The activities that are more prevalent today, they are not the ones that existed in 81. And when we compare Sheffield, their biggest exporting activity shown in the previous slide, exporting and warehousing, and the other large cities except London, we see first that productivity it's lower in Sheffield, and a lot of these places that productivity is higher, the most prevalent exporting activity, it's related with some kind of services. So computer programming in Leeds, management consulting activities in Manchester. Bristol is an exception here, but we can see that most of them have been starting specializing in some type of service exports, which may be behind their emergence in the last 4 decades. So here, these figures were at the city level. And when we look at city centers specifically, that the Center for City advocates and believes that they have a very specific role in exporting services, Sheffield seems to be underperforming as well. So on the left hand side, the chart shows that from these cities, the large one, Sheffield, has the lowest productivity in its city center, and we haven't seen an enormous job growth. We had a slight decline between 98 and 2015 in jobs in the city center of Sheffield, while, for example, in Manchester, we had an enormous growth in jobs in the city center, and to a lower degree, but still very significant in most cities. City center job growth was somewhere between 20 and 40%. Which may explain why cities like Leeds are 30% more productive than Sheffield in the city center, and Manchester, it's around 50% more productive in the city center. Manchester and Birmingham's Leeds productivity at the city center, it's very, very high levels at the national context. Well, part of it may have to do with the composition of the city center itself. So we know from previous research that Sheffield city center does not have much office space as a share of total commercial space, and their quality seems to be below average, and it has a relatively high prevalence of retail space. So we see here from the 4 cities, picked Sheffield, Manchester, Leeds, and Birmingham. The other 3 cities are the one with the most productive city centers. Retail is more prevalent in Sheffield, which I think it highlights this idea that Sheffield city center, to some extent, of course, there's production, but it's a place of consumption and economy with the service exporting sector not so strong. So it's more of a place of consumption. And I think one of the challenges here is turning Sheffield in a place of production, the city center, a place of production and exports of services. But we know that like city center office quality and attracting businesses to the city center services mainly, it's not enough. So for us to have a strong city center in Sheffield and spread the benefits in South Yorkshire, we need better connectivity, especially at the public transport level. So if you look at this map, this is travel time data, private provider. This data has around a year now, but we can see that the purple shade is the area that can reach Sheffield city center in 30 minutes or less by public transport. And we see that this area does not fully cover Sheffield local authority. It doesn't include Rotherham, and it is around just 30% of Sheffield's population and around 20% of the combined authority total population. So, and no, under this data set that was downloaded last year, no place in Doncaster or Barnsley can reach the city center of Sheffield in 30 minutes by public transport. So to make South Yorkshire a single economic area and become a global competitive city over the long term, connectivity, especially on public transport, will be fundamental in our view. When we look at Sheffield, here is just Sheffield and Rotherham, to comparable European peers from a paper we did last year, we see a strong difference. So cities in Western Europe with relatively same population as Sheffield, they tend to attract more than 80% of their population, 80, in 30 minutes or less by public transport. This is a problem that we see in most cities in the UK, the large ones, but Sheffield, we can see that the gap is particularly strong. And public transport infrastructure will play a role. The amount of stations from trams, trains, buses, you have the frequency and the quality, but something that it's not often talked about is the urban composition. So in a lot of European cities, we know that especially in the city centers, surrounding areas, we have this prevalence of denser urban environments, apartment buildings, which allow people to walk to the city center. We have more people next to the stations, and this figure shows the differences. So if you look at areas, according to Eurostat, with more than 10,000 residents per square kilometer, only 6% of Sheffield population, it's eligible in that definition. If we go to cities similar size in Southern Europe, like Turin, Bilbao, and Marseille, these levels are as high as 60%, but even in other places more similar to the UK in terms of urban living, like Rotterdam and Lille, it has at least twice the amount of people living in dense areas. So fixing public transport, we need to look what we call the supply side, the amount of stations and a track we have, but also the demand side, how many people we have living around these stations. It's a very, very important component. So in a nutshell, our research shows that South Yorkshire economy lacks a strong service exporting sector. And to create a thriving city center in Sheffield, I think it's a very, very important point to become a global competitive city. Being able to export services and the city center of the major city in the region will be very, very important in that sense. Improved skills will be important. There have been some initiatives over time in the region, and increasing the quality and the quantity of office space, I think it's also another challenge. But for this equation to work of a strong city center spreading the benefits around the region, we really need better integration of the region as a single economic area. We have been for a long time advocating for bus franchising. I think combined authorities should follow the steps of Greater Manchester. So they would have the powers to set routes, frequencies, prices. They would be able to cross subsidization across routes. And then I think we have to start having a conversation about increasing the amount of people living to good areas with good public transport. So one way of doing it would be at the national level doing planning reform, making it more rules-based than a case-by-case discretionary system as we have now. And at the local level, I think local development orders around stations would be a way of making the system more rules-based and promote development around stations. The recently announced Brownfield Fund should also be seen as a way of both promoting densification in areas with good public transport, and also a way in some cases to increase the quality and the quantity of office space in a city. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. Stop sharing. Yeah.
Thanks, Guilherme. Thank you for running us through the research that you've done and picking up on several themes and highlighting some of the challenges that we're collectively facing, really. at this juncture go into a bit of a question and answer session, and people have started to put some questions in the chat, so I'd like to encourage those of you on the webinar today, please feel free to put questions into the chat, but also to raise your hand and ask them in person as well. That's always encouraged. From my perspective, Guilherme, I think you've identified a series of challenges, and I think your last slide also touched upon some of the solutions, and some of those solutions are not always within our powers, certainly at a local level, which is of interest to the broader levelling up agenda around devolution, but also about how we can sort of situate it itself. Just one question from me as we go forward. It looked there through some of your data that Glasgow was perhaps on a trajectory to become a globally competitive city. It was sort of starting to work its way up on productivity measures. It wasn't as far behind on some of the connectivity issues, etc. Is that sort of that may be, you know, sort of a longer term ambition by the Scottish government, or even locally, but is that sort of the feeling that there's perhaps sort of a next rung down of cities that could step up, or are we just too far away still?
I think some cities, Glasgow shows that direction. Some of the data, it's less consistent, I would say, to Glasgow, but there's some very encouraging signals in Glasgow. A place like Manchester, Leeds, if you look at Leeds separately, not at the West Yorkshire, I think. So I would say a place like Leeds, the challenge seems to be similar to South Yorkshire. Now it's about making the area one single economic zone. The core local authority, the city centre, are making very good progress in the last decades. So if I would classify, I would say, for example, West Yorkshire in this diagnosis would be like slightly a step ahead, in the sense that, like, probably the city centre was already stronger, but the connectivity issues, all these problems. For Glasgow, I think there are two things to unpack. On the public transport side, we know that the network is quite comprehensive, by historical reasons, especially the metro system. It exists for a long time, and it serves the city very, very well when you compare internationally the size of the network. But I think more than picking, like looking at some of these places and the trends of improving and saying these are the 2 or 3 places that could be the global competitive cities, I think we should look at the upward trend as it is possible to improve. I think, as you said, a lot of it nowadays is still in national government hands, and I think we have been huge advocates of devolution. I think places understand their challenges better, they know how to adapt to their needs, and also they need to benefit from local growth for example, in a fiscal level. So at these places like Glasgow and Manchester, I think it shows that there's a renaissance of these cities that for a long time, especially in the last century, were seen as a problem to manage. And some of them, I think we see the trajectory that they're creating value, showing their strengths. And if some could have done it and probably keep improving, we probably could see that in more.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. I'll just combine 2 questions in the chat, and then I'll go to Mark, who's patiently got his hand up. So geography and economics always get on, but the question really is geography a factor? So 2 elements here really, that Sheffield borders the Peak District, which I suppose is sort of somewhat of a massive benefit, a massive environmental benefit as well, but also is potentially a geographical challenge in accessing other cities and other urban areas to the west. And then related to that, there's also you know, areas of green belt between Sheffield and Doncaster, and that sort of geographical challenge is I suppose sort of related to how South Yorkshire is potentially more polycentric than monocentric compared to, say, Greater Manchester, which sort of has that sort of big city centre, but with other areas around it, but is much more monocentric in my perspective.
Yeah, I think so. And for example, for Greater Manchester and West Midlands, our definition of city, it's very, very similar to the Combined Authority, which basically suggests what you said, Jonathan, that it's very monocentric. And while when we look at the South Yorkshire or other combined authorities like West Yorkshire, we identify more than one city, which by definition shows that these places are more polycentric. And I think geography will always make them more polycentric. But I think one of the big challenges of the combined authority, it's not thinking that the city will be monocentric, but if you live in any of these local authorities, you should be able to have the benefits, absorb the benefits that happen in another. We should not expect in the next decades, like, to have Sheffield as the core city center, totally monocentric, but we cannot ignore, especially on the connectivity problems. We cannot ignore challenges like if we have a very, very successful Sheffield city center or other city in the combined authority, the connectivity into place would not allow us to make everyone benefit out of it. So I think geography plays a huge role. It's harder, but I think we need to think that even if they continue being polycentric, that's not a reason not to try to integrate them more closer. Probably they will never be like Greater Manchester, and probably it should not be the case, but they should be more integrated, I think.
Yeah, that really interesting. Anecdotally, I was at the weekend speaking to my nephew, who is finishing his GCSEs. He lives in Bury, and I said, "Oh, are you going to Bury College?" And he said, "No, I'm off to Middleton College." And for the first thing, my geography of Greater Manchester was being tested there, but also the transport connectivity was good enough that, you know, that is an option, really. And my first thought was, would a young person similarly in South Yorkshire, in, for example, Barnsley, Rotherham, have that as an immediate option for them? And I worry that it perhaps wouldn't be, and particularly when he told me that his journey would be under an hour. So that's enough about my anecdotes from the weekend. So Mark, you've got your hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. It was just really, I was very interested in that slide that showed the breakdown of the usage of city centres, which showed that that Sheffield had a higher proportion that's used in retail than cities such as Leeds and Manchester. However, I think it wouldn't have escaped anybody that the city centre of Sheffield has been suffering a lot, particularly in recent years, and in comparison with the likes of Leeds and Manchester, retail would seem to be much more vibrant in those cities. So I was just trying to understand why that slide was showing something that appeared to be something different to perhaps what you could see on the ground, unless I'm misunderstanding it.
I think I may have an answer to that, Guilherme. Please correct me if not. So I think it's about was it about the percentage share? And I think that is perhaps the balance that we're looking at. So whilst Greater Manchester and Leeds have much bigger retail centres, the relative comparison to offices or other employment land is less. So whilst Sheffield has a smaller retail space, the comparison to office space, it makes it seem larger. Is that right, Guilherme?
It is. So we built a tool. So the type of figures I showed today you can see for the 63 or 62, I'm not entirely sure if Belfast is included in our website, and you can see also the space of like industrial space. For example, Sheffield and Birmingham from those city centers, the share of industrial space, it's higher than the others. And when we look at space, we consider as well, for example, empty shops. If they are allocated, the commercial property space is allocated. So sometimes we have a paper from some years ago that we see this dynamic, that places with a higher proportion of retail space in their high streets tend to be the ones with the highest vacancies in retail. So for the retail or, for example, food and drink sectors to analyze the strength, I personally like to see, for example, vacancy rates. I think they show a closer perception of reality, because if there's a lot of demand. And now with the new e-commercial use class, retail, offices, food and drink, they are under the same class. So adapting offices to retail and the other way around, it's easier now than it was some years ago.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think you're right though, Mark. You know, that does sort of jump out as being slightly unusual. I think, you know, it's somewhat explained by some of the data, but as Guilherme said, it also requires unpicking, because when we start to sort of, you know, scrape away at that, there's higher levels of industrial, there's perhaps more you know, higher levels of empty units, and all of that comes around that sort of healthy yeah, healthy urban centres. I suppose sort of one thing that we have also seen is the pandemic, and there has been some research highlighting that major urban centres, so global cities, are likely to feel some pressures from what we're experiencing. So, you know, people working from home more often, etc., is more likely to impact London than it is Sheffield, and particularly because of that data. So, yeah, time is elapsing, and the trends may change again. Got some other people with their hands up, can't quite see. Laurie, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, thanks. Just a thought on that one, actually, on the previous point around retail split, is that I wonder whether in your definition of Sheffield city centre that might include Meadowhall, our shopping centre, which is kind of halfway between Sheffield and Rotherham. So that's more of an out of town, you know, mall rather than urban high streets. But I wonder if it fits in that definition. That said, I would have thought that your definition would, you know, apply in other city centres as well. So, say Manchester, that would encapsulate the Arndale, in Birmingham, the Bullring, and so on. So, probably wouldn't disadvantage Sheffield particularly badly. But yeah, just a couple of questions from me actually. So, first of all, I was wondering whether, and sorry if you ran through this, but whether there are cases in the UK, some cities which are not far off your definition of being globally competitive, so kind of close. You know, I get the impression that's not the case for South Yorkshire and Sheffield, but whether there are some which kind of are close to that threshold. And then sort of linked to that, your chart with the quadrant where you had a bunch of clusters of cities and how they compared, I think, since the early 80s to today, and then also towns. I was quite struck by the fact that quite a lot of towns are in that kind of higher up quadrant where they do have complexity still. I'm just wondering if that was a bit of a phenomenon in the UK, or if you see that in your comparators around Europe, whether there are these bunch of smaller towns which don't fall into your definition of you know, a global city, but actually they have quite a lot of complex, you know, economic complexity going on there. So just whether is that a UK thing, or do you see that in comparative countries as well? Thanks.
So in terms of the city center answer, I don't know it, but I have here the definition in a map, so I can show, so maybe it helps. Can you see the map? So the large cities, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham will have similar radius. So the size of our radius in city center changes depending on the size of the city. So the radius of Barnsley, for example, will be smaller. And then the city center is based on employment data. It's the center, it's the place with more jobs in the city, the LSOA, and then we do the radius. So I'm not sure if it helps you with that question, but I'm happy to send.
Yeah, it does. It does help. I think with Meadowhall doesn't fit in there. I think it's further northeast. So yeah, that's interesting.
But I'm happy to share the definitions of Sheffield and the other ones, the city centers, if you have interest. In terms of cities that are getting closer. So on balance, when we look at productivity levels and the size, I would say Edinburgh, it's the closest city. Productivity levels are I think they're in line with what we define as a global competitive city. And we know that Edinburgh, it's comparable with some relatively good performing cities like Bilbao in Spain, Madrid. I think it fails a little bit still in the size of the metro area because we think it's very important to have the size component. Otherwise, we would call places like Reading, going, I think, for your last question, places like Reading, we would call them global competitive cities, and we are here discussing if they are cities or towns. So I think on balance, Edinburgh would be the closest city to become globally competitive in our framework. In terms of smaller cities or large towns being productive, complex, and if we see that in other places, I think you always see that everywhere. So, for example, we know that in Germany, specific cities with the auto industry, it's very prevalent. They sometimes show very, very, very high levels of productivity. I think in the UK, that quadrant, if you see the colors, I can show you later. Most of the cities in there, the Greater Southeast and around London. So we see it, but in very, very specific conditions of UK urban geography. We don't see places that were always complex in the last 4 decades, small, and that are very far from London. I think that's quite particular to the UK. And the amount of places that are productive and small, we have some in Europe, not as large. And I think it also has to do with the physical constraints to growth in some of these places in the UK. So urban containment, for example, I think affected some of these places not becoming larger. The same way that urban containment in Birmingham in the past, in the 70s, did not allow the city to grow as much as it would without that policy, for example. So I think it's a combination of both. Having a lot of cities around London and urban containment, I think, made them structurally maybe smaller than some comparative cities in Western Europe.
Fabulous. Just move on, and I'll reward Danny for putting his hand up. Danny, do you want to ask your question? Then I'll go to the chat.
Yes, please. Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. Danny Dickinson from Digital Catapult. It's more part of observation and part of a question here, but really struck in terms of what the themes are coming out in terms of the future of cities more broadly, and also like the use of space. So we did hear some really important points around the importance of office space. I think we can also term that in language of collaboration space, as well as obviously the sort of typical model, and what we think this kind of means going forward. So although we're seeing people go back to the city post-COVID, we're maybe not seeing people go back into the office. There's a lot of people going to coffee shops and so forth, conferences, and of course we all go to, and what this means for the way we use space and the way we use our cities. So, for example, could university real estate play an important role in opening up a lot more collaboration spaces for people to do the activities that they go into a city for, as opposed to the old corporate model of maybe some people who would have needed to have had a sort of a presence and enough space for everyone to be in 5 days a week, not really wanting to buy that up anymore, but still wanting to get people together and a lot more of a sort of fragmented or innovative basis. But also the role of cities in not just bringing organisations together, of course, but all of the people that they work with and the way that innovation happens. So where are the kind of opportunities within this, I guess? And in Sheffield's context, we've talked about the physical geography and obviously the makeup of the city so far. Do we see any opportunities here post-COVID that maybe are going to be apparent now, which maybe weren't before the pandemic?
I think there's a little bit of a question for me, but also for colleagues from councils as well. But I suppose my answer to that is I think there is a lot of opportunity. I think there's a lot of opportunity to rethink how space is used, but also to be mindful that we don't know what's coming down the track. So I think it was really interesting, Guilherme's point around quality of space, and I think quality could also be linked to flexibility. So, for example, many of us have offices or office space that can't be flexibly adapted to, for example, have co-working space, or even in the case of Broad Street West, we more meeting rooms and be reconfigured, without some cost implication. And I think that's definitely a space that we should be rethinking office space, but also leisure facilities and retail. And I'm minded to give an example, which I think is perhaps really quite exciting to think about that flexibility. So the wool market in Doncaster is sort of, for me, as an outsider, not having been involved in the detail of it, is could be adapted to a future that is much more leisure-based, much more retail-based, co-working space, etc. And there are many more places like that, but they need to be reconfigured in that space. So I think the opportunity is there. It will require investment, and I think, as you said, organisations like the universities can play a role in that in Sheffield, and where there is existing office space, there may need to be either the private sector or further sort of public sector intervention to support that journey. Guilherme, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
I lost the connection for a while, so sorry if I repeat something. I think that the office quality point that Jonathan made, it's very important. So in the center, we are relatively optimistic. Time will tell that cities will play an important part. Maybe people are not going 5 days a week, but I think they will continue going on a relatively regular basis. So I think they are important places, and the role of the office probably will shift, being more collaborative than before. I think it's a clear example of the importance of devolution, bridging the needs, the challenge, the feedback it gets, trying to, as you say, like bridge academia, for example, with the needs of the employer, needs of startups, graduates that want to start businesses, that it's just impossible to do it from Whitehall. And I think for a place like Sheffield, understanding what are the new demands, if there are new demands, and responding to it, it's key to make its city center as competitive or more competitive than others. So I think it's like the devolution, it's a good example how devolution could inform us better on that sense. And then we know that, for example, retail has been facing competition from e-commerce, and I think the new commercial space rules that would allow you, for example, to have more service-based, experience-based high streets, for example, with restaurants, bars. It's important to adjust to new times. If you have a commercial space that needs to be stuck on a specific type of service or shop, we don't have this flexibility. So I think there are some opportunities now that commercial space, it's easier to transform.
Thanks for that, Guilherme. Thanks for the question, Danny. Just moving on to some of the questions in the chat, and doing my best to cover this off here. There were three separate questions really about how transport connectivity is important, and one being, do globally competitive cities need to have an airport? The second one perhaps being, we have a tram network, but clearly I think, and you mentioned the bus network being particularly important, but is there really a need to link up our urban centres by tram as well, and also I suppose sort of the role of a centre. Should we be thinking of Meadowhall as a development sort of a further sort of focal point, bearing in mind geography teachers will be scratching their heads on that last point. So I suppose start with the tram and the airport point, Guilherme.
So on the tram and buses, so I think one of the very important points about bus franchising is it's coordinating all modes of transport. So we stop having competition between trams and even trains with buses, and we make the network as complementary as possible, and with not having competition that in the end of the day reduce ridership and quality in a lot of cases. So I would say we are relatively agnostic about if the best way to integrate it is with rapid bus systems, tram systems, or trains. We know there are some trade-offs. For example, buses and rapid buses tend to be faster to implement, for example, and to adjust. Probably they have other weaknesses, so we don't have a very, very strong view. I think it's case by case basis, and I think it's another case while like the importance of devolution and understanding local challenges and the delivery and all these kind of things. I think the density points and having more residents around the stations, it includes buses as well. So sometimes we ignore like bus stations are also stations, and having people around them can increase their mobility significantly. On the airport one, so it's something that we haven't covered. We know the more recent news about the airport in the region. As we look at urban economies, we typically look at the daily commutes. The airport one, I think it's an hard one. I don't have an answer. If you need an airport around, probably. I'm not sure if the geography of the airports will be at the regional combined authority level. So an anecdote, for example, because I think there's a trade-off between having a lot of airports, dispersion, and having airports with a lot of options and that supply you flights, both passengers and freight, to a lot of places and with frequency. For example, in the north of Spain and north of Portugal, I'm from Portugal, north of Portugal, Porto has one airport, and the autonomous region north of Portugal, the Galician one, has around, I think, 4 airports. It's much more dispersed. The airports became smaller, I think, because of the dispersion. And Porto, by being more concentrated, I think it became a hub. And a lot of businesses, even in the Spanish side, I believe they will probably use the Portuguese one because of the benefits of agglomeration. So I think there are two forces here playing to both places. I think it really depends on what is our goal on having the airport. Is having a very, very strong airport in a region that can connect a global competitive city to everywhere in the world. And I think around that part of the world, Manchester is in a better position in that sense, I think, than Liverpool or Sheffield. But the other way, it's looking the opposite way. I think if one of these cities become very, very competitive, the demand for the airport will, to have a global competitive airport, will show up.
Thanks, Guilherme, and well done for doing your research to understand what's going on sort of locally around that. There have also been questions around going back to the office area about the lack of office supply being a reflection of a lack of demand in Sheffield, and the point also being made is that there's a lot of public sector employment in Sheffield city centre particularly, which is a driver for economic activity, but also means that sometimes that market is perhaps sort of slightly sort of challenged in that the private sector isn't driving it really.
Yeah, I think the complexity analysis supported, and the fact that city center jobs in from 89 to 2015 show that there was a net decline, show that like there's a clear, it's not only about supply. I don't want to make that argument that if you make good office quality space, you'll have the demand for it immediately, but it's part of the equation. I think that's important, but I think focusing on like having Sheffield, trying to make Sheffield a place that exports services, and South Yorkshire Combined Authority a place that exports services in the same way that London does, and Manchester's probably is doing more recently. It will require office space. It doesn't mean that you need the demand. We need to attract investments to see the interest, but it's clearly something that it will probably need to happen to become a global competitive city. But it's, of course, and I haven't mentioned much in the presentation, but the role of skills in the workforce, it's very important for businesses to be interested in an area as well. We know that that's one of the main reasons why businesses locate in not only London, but some cities around London, like Brighton or Reading. So I think of course, you have to have the formula right to have the demand.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'm just conscious of time. There have been further questions around devolution and devolved angle. Jonathan, really happy to pick that up offline. I know that Centre for Cities have done some really great research around devolved powers and what the trailblazers will mean. And similarly, there have been some questions really in here on functional economic area around the role of the visitor economy and further indicators that perhaps we can pick up offline. But I'm very conscious of the time. I also wanted to thank Guilherme for his time, for his level of clarity in his presentation, and for being very flexible in your answering today. And were we to be in an auditorium, I'm sure people would be giving you a round of applause now and saying thank you very much, including David, who's giving that there. So thank you, obrigado to you as well. And what we'll do is we'll send around the slides afterwards, and we'd like to keep the conversation going on this. So Guilherme, if we can pick this up again, that would be great.
Thank you very much for your time, and if you need any clarification on the data or more information, let me know. I'm happy to share.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day. Speak soon.
You too. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.